Hey there everyone, what's up? Back today with a different kind of video. Today we're not talking about games, we are talking about horror television. And I want to talk about this topic because it's something I'm pretty interested in, but when I was a kid in the 80s, um, and this is probably about, 1988 or so, there used to be on TV a kind of long block of horror television, and this was like um, about 4 hours almost of horror television once a week. On I believe Saturday nights it was. There were horror television shows, and they're not just horror. They're kind of like your science fiction is also in there, but these kind of horror anthology shows that were on television in a huge block, and I used to stay up all night watching them. I think they started at 10 o'clock or so and went on until about 2 a.m. It may have started at 9 and went on to 1. I'm remembering from the late 80s, so it's kind of a little fuzzy. But the TV shows I remember quite clearly, and I bought a lot of them on DVD. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk about those shows that were on and give you guys just some, I don't know, an introduction to the 80s horror block, which was something that I always looked forward to every weekend, staying up and watching these various TV shows. So, some of them I don't have. Some of them aren't out on DVD yet. So, um, I'll talk a little about those, but I don't have anything to show, so it's not as interesting. But we'll start, of course, with the granddaddy of them all. We've got. This is the Twilight Zone. This is the original series. This is the complete original series. It's 28 DVDs apparently. It's quite good though. This was on in that horror block. It was the first show out of the bunch, and because we're talking about the 80s here, there actually was a new Twilight Zone series in the 80s. Here, Twilight Zone from the 80s. It had different stories. It had a few remakes of the classic series, but mostly some new stuff. And it did have a lot of kind of stars that showed up in it. So there's, the first episode stars Bruce Willis before he was super famous and still had some hair. But, and then, of course, filling it out, there's the 2003, I think this came out, Twilight Zone. Not quite as good as either of the other series, but also not on in that block in the 80s. But the original series for the Twilight Zone was on, and the new series. So they would kind of switch back and forth between those. So they would rerun obviously the new series is only 2 seasons, but the old series is 5. So they would rerun old episodes of the Twilight Zone and parts of the new episodes. So you'd get a new episode sometimes and an old episode sometimes. But keeping in kind of sync with that, also they played this. This is the Alfred Hitchcock Presents. This was on the USA Network actually, which wasn't part of the horror block, but it just happened to come on right before the horror block started, so you could kind of warm yourself up for the horror block with Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And Alfred Hitchcock Presents is a pretty old show. It is in black and white. It's entirely black and white, but it does have. They're not really horror shows. Like the tales aren't really horror. They're more like suspense. But it does get you in that kind of horror-esque mood where you watch Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and it's kind of usually like some kind of murder story or some kind of suspense thriller. And, of course, Alfred Hitchcock will come out and say, between every episode, Alfred Hitchcock comes out and says something, or he's doing something strange. Like, he's in, like, a bizarre torture situation, but he's completely calm and he's just narrating the episode, the beginning of the episode. Much in the same way Rod Serling would come out and say something before the Twilight Zone episodes. So there's always that. But the Alfred Hitchcock Presents does have a lot of pretty good episodes. And it's not nearly as good as the original Twilight Zone, but it is good. And continuing on, Also on the USA Network, which I don't have DVDs for, was a show called The Hitchhiker, which I believe was actually originally on HBO, but they moved it to the USA Network later on. But The Hitchhiker was somewhat horror, somewhat suspense kind of TV show where the narrator was this guy who was the hitchhiker, and he would just come out in the beginning of the show and give you your basic opening, and then he would give you like the closing statement for the show, basically, in the same way that I guess Rod Serling and Alfred Hitchcock did in their respective shows. But the Hitchhiker was a little bit different in theme. It was nowhere near as good as either of those, and currently there's not a DVD set of those except in Canada, which is weird. It's only a set of the series is only released in Canada. It was never released in the U.S. and I haven't been able to order it. If anyone is in Canada and feels like sending me a box set of DVDs for the Hitchhiker, that would be awesome. But I don't expect anybody to do that. So eventually, I guess I'll get it if I ever go to Canada and happen to see it. Otherwise, for some reason, Amazon Canada won't ship to me. Amazon US will, Amazon Canada will not. I don't know. Continuing on, though, there are a bunch of other series. There is a Night Gallery, which didn't actually show up in that horror block normally. Night Gallery came on, they started showing episodes of it afterwards with actually Kolchak the Night Stalker, which I don't have in my hand, but it's right behind me, so I'll just grab it. Kolchak the Night Stalker. These two series were on together at a different time, but Kolchak the Night Stalker Kolchak is a kind of a newspaper reporter who hunts down occult stories. So there's a bunch of like weird monsters and things that show up in this Kolchak the Night Stalker, and it's pretty interesting. There's actually a movie, and there was a kind of remake of that TV show called Night Stalker that was nowhere near as good as the original. And the original's not that great, but it does star the guy who was the dad in A Christmas Story, so you can't go wrong with that. And of course, Night Gallery, which I held up for a bit, but Night Gallery was the show that Rod Serling did after the Twilight Zone, and it is a bit more horror-based. It's more horrific than the Twilight Zone, which had a bunch of science fiction stuff. This doesn't have any science fiction. It's all mostly horror-based. And instead of the Twilight Zone, you have the Night Gallery, where Rod Serling will come out in front of paintings, and the paintings will have something related to the horror of the episode, I guess. And they're not all scary. Some of it is goofy. There's like just goofy short horror tales. Dracula goes to the blood bank and stuff like that. But generally, Night Gallery is all right. It's nowhere near as good as Twilight Zone, but it's all right. It does have some Lovecraft adaptations in this too, which I was happy to see, even though they're not that good. But back to the 80s block, which the 80s block really, it started with Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and then you would have The Hitchhiker, and those two would be on. And then after that, you would switch channels to, I believe, CBS, and then you'd have The Twilight Zone. And after The Twilight Zone, you'd have this show right here, Tales from the Darkside. And this is the complete series of Tales from the Darkside. It's 4 seasons. And Tales from the Darkside is a kind of horror anthology show where it's much like the Twilight Zone, except much more horror based, and it does kind of switch between more serious horror to kind of goofiness. So some of the episodes are pretty goofy, and there are lots of like goofiness to it. It's not exactly like horrific. There's not a lot of blood or murder or anything in those TV shows, and none of them really have that. They're all just kind of a more, I don't know, adult-focused horror anthologies. You know, there are those kid-focused ones like Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps or whatever, but think of these as more like grown-up versions of those, because they're not especially horrific. They're just a kind of entertaining horror anthology show, and that's like all of these are pretty much that. But Tales from the Dark Side is a really good one because it does start out actually trying to be more serious horror, but as the seasons go on, there are a lot of goofiness, lots of kind of goofier episodes there that are like comedy horror or kind of absurdist horror almost. And you'll find that Tales from the Dark Side, the scariest part of the show is usually the opening theme, which is creepy. It's still creepy now, even to listen to. The Tales from the Dark Side theme is pretty interesting. So there's a movie also of Tales from the Dark Side. It's not incredibly good, but it does show you give you a good example of how the show is. And some of the stories in the movie, I believe, are parts of the show. So you can kind of get a good example of what it's about. But after that, you usually had this show. This is Friday the 13th, the series, and you're thinking like Friday the 13th TV series? What the hell is that? How could you possibly make a series out of that? You can't. There's no Jason in this movie. There's no relation to the actual Friday the 13th movie. The series is based on a group of people hunting down cursed objects that came from a kind of antique store where the owner of the store made a pact with the devil, and that owner died, but he was the uncle of one of the people, or the two of the people, and a friend of the other person who is part of this group that is hunting down the cursed objects. And they're Mickey, Jack, and Ryan. There's three people, two guys and a lady. And the series is actually pretty good. It's pretty interesting. It is a horror-based thing, and people almost always die in the episodes. But it's not gory. It's usually just you have this certain cursed object that does something, and all of the cursed objects require you to kill somebody. I think there's almost no episodes where the cursed object doesn't require some kind of murder, but usually the cursed object will have gained some kind of magical power by killing somebody, and the person will be happy with that magical power, so they'll continue killing people to get whatever the cursed item is giving them. And these people will hunt down the items. They have a registry of all the items that were sold, so they're hunting them down, and they're trying to lock them away in a vault. That's pretty much the story. Eventually, the third season changes, actually, where one of the characters left the show, and they added another guy in his place, which is goofy. And the way they got rid of him is even goofier in the show, because they reverted him to a child. And, like, one of the cursed objects reverted him to childhood, so they added a new guy. And that kind of is what happened. And then you have this show right here. This is Monsters. Monsters is a horror anthology obviously based around monsters. So each show has a kind of monster in it, but this one actually isn't less horrific than most of them. Tales from the Dark Side is more horrific than Monsters, and Monsters is much more a kind of goofy horror anthology. So there are things like, like a girl brings home her boyfriend who happens to be a zombie or whatever, or like there's a zombie outbreak and the boyfriend comes over to take her to the prom and he's a zombie, but like and his parents want to kill him, but he's a nice zombie. There's stuff like that. There's some more kind of serious monster type stories, but most of them are just kind of goofy. I think there's a Clive Barker story in one of these, but that might be Tales from the Dark Side. Yattering and Jack is the story. But this Monsters box set is pretty new. It only came out like 2 weeks ago or something. I had it pre-ordered from when it came out originally, but this is actually, it's made by the same person who made Tales from the Dark Side, Richard P. Rubenstein. If you watched any of these kind of horror anthologies in the 80s, you'll recognize that name right away because he was the producer for like pretty much all of them. And Monsters is kind of the classic one that everybody remembers. Like the opening scene starts out and there's like this kind of monster family. The wife is like a cyclops and the dad is like this bizarre potato man with a million eyes. It's pretty awesome. But this show is pretty interesting, actually. I would really recommend this one. Um, there are a few more shows that were part of that. This is the Ray Bradbury Theater, and the Ray Bradbury Theater is a great series. This box set is actually, I think, 4 or 5 seasons. It's all of the seasons, and it's really cheap. I think you can buy it for like $10. It's totally worth it. If you're a fan of Ray Bradbury, you have to see this because there's about, I think, 65 episodes in the series, and most of them are direct kind of direct to TV translations of Ray Bradbury short stories. And if you've ever read like the Martian Chronicles, most of the stories in the Martian Chronicles are done in this TV show. If you've ever read October Country, October Country stories are almost entirely in here. Almost all of them, I think. And some of them are done really well. A lot of these are done really great. I think out of all of the series, I've probably watched this set the most, only because I'm a pretty big fan of Ray Bradbury's short stories, and this one really does them justice, I think, even though, like, obviously it's an 80s TV production, so it's not like the super highest quality now, but it is still pretty good, and I think you would enjoy it. Ooh, I kicked the camera there. You would enjoy it if you like Ray Bradbury. That's about it for the DVDs I can talk about. There were other shows that were not that don't have DVD sets. The main one I can think of, though, is Freddy's Nightmares, which is actually based on Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a TV show that's it's bizarre because it was an hour long, and Freddy's Nightmares did have Freddy in it, sort of. Like, he would come out and narrate in the first season, Freddy actually played a little bit of a part in the show. Like, he would come out and do things in the show, but so he would actually be like in people's dreams, torturing people or whatever. But as the seasons went on, I mean, I think there's only 2, but as the shows went on, and then the second season entirely, like, Freddy didn't actually do anything in the story. Like, he would kind of narrate. So he would come out and say something, some kind of Freddy one-liners, and then you would go into this horror story, and then the show was an hour, so it would be like a half-hour story in the beginning, and then one of the minor characters from the beginning of the show you'd branch off to them, and it would be a totally different story for the second half based on the minor character from the beginning of the show. So it was actually a pretty interesting way to run the show, because you'd go through and, like, there'd be episodes where, like, there was one where, like, a TV show host is, like, he's like Morin Downey Jr., which is another, like, dated 80s reference that nobody will remember, but Morin Downey Jr. was, like, this loudmouth TV show host before Jerry Springer, essentially. And the show was kind of like him, but the first half of the show was about that guy, and then, like, the second half was about some guest who was supposed to be on that show but didn't end up showing up, and then it branches off to his story about where he was and what it came to. And there's another one about psychics and things that, like, halfway through the episode it turns into, like, a channeler instead of, like, some person who is, like, researching psychic phenomena or something. It's really weird because, like, the way you never know who it's going to branch off to, and, like, I thought that was a really interesting way. And then Freddy barely showed up. He, like, didn't do anything usually in the story. He would just kind of narrate and give a little quip and make fun of people's pain, I guess, in the show, which it was really a pretty good show. I kind of wish there was an official DVD release for those series, because I would totally buy that, because that was a pretty underrated show, despite it being sort of based on A Nightmare on Elm Street, even though it's not really. Except the first episode was like a origin story for Freddy, but after that it just kind of went off on its own thing, and it was totally good. So yeah, that's about all the shows I can think of from that kind of horror block, and they switched in and out every once in a while, so the times would switch, and you'd get, like, Ray Bradbury Theater would be on instead of Alfred Hitchcock Presents or something, or The Hitchhiker would be at a different time, and you'd get something else. So you could always watch all of them. You could switch between right after one finished, another one would be on another channel. And these weren't all on the same channel, but it ended up being like about a 4 hour block of constant horror in the late 80s on television, and that was totally something that is missing, I think, these days. Um, if you guys have any recommendations for horror anthologies, uh, let me know. I'm sure I actually do have more, but they're not part of this 80s block. They're more part of different generations of stuff, which I didn't mean to talk about. So yeah, that's about it. I just wanted to talk about some of these horror anthologies and see if you guys had any similar memories or different memories based on different shows. So if you do, just talk about it below. Tell me about the horror anthologies you like, or ones that you think I should check out if I haven't mentioned them. So yeah, that's about it. I will catch you guys next time.